What a pleasure it is to do this and to be here with you. What a great community, and a great cross-cultural, multicultural community, but also, let me say, one which is the core of which is outstanding bicultural Chinese scholarship in this era. And I think that is carrying the field of education and higher education studies in many ways. And the young people we're seeing coming through in the research-intensive universities, coming out of Chinese educational background and working, coming from via directly from the mainland to the West, or from Hong Kong to the West, or from both to the West and back again. We're seeing really outstanding work. I mean, Lily epitomizes that, and many others too, let me say. And so this is, like, in many respects, this is one of the core homes of this kind of work. And as I've said, I think this is going to become more important kind of work. That kind of bicultural understanding is so crucial in this environment, and especially in this geopolitical environment. People who really understand what's going on are people who are able to look through the eyes of everyone and see simultaneously how it's seen by everyone else. Let me thank the Tin Cup Hing Foundation. It's fabulous that you're supporting the faculty so well, and I'm really grateful to you today for supporting the lecture. I know how important foundation money and private money is in Hong Kong, and how there's so many public-spirited people in the private sector and in the charity sector, as we call it in the UK, who support education and see it as crucial and important. And that is one of the reasons why this is such a strong city for education, and one of the reasons why education is mainstreamed, given dignity, given status, which it doesn't always have in the English-speaking world. It's given a central importance, as it should have, in terms of reproduction of the society. Thank you very much to Cheryl for her help, to me, Cheryl Chung, for her help with my trip, and her fine words, which I think she contributed to Yang Rei's excellent opening. I thought you had it exactly right. And let me too, while I'm starting, acknowledge Hugo, who's here, my fellow editor-in-chief in higher education. What a pleasure it is to see him in his home patch. He has more than one home patch, but this is certainly an important one. And what an outstanding scholar he is. And again, a good example of how HKU was able to bring people of talent from across the world together in this school. And let me acknowledge also So-Yong Lee, who's just finished her PhD on self-formation, academic self-formation. What an outstanding piece of work that is. And let me recommend her to you. Any talent scouts who are looking for a really outstanding emerging faculty, you could not do better. I've taught with So-Yong for 2 years. She is fantastic in the classroom, but she's also a great researcher. So here she is. Your opportunity to sign her up is here right now. So, I mean, and let me say too that in opening that HKU is doing really well as it looked from outside. I mean, the school the education school here is, I mean, what's the best education school in the world? Is it Stanford? I mean, is it Cambridge? There are many possibilities, but HKU is right in the middle of that kind of conversation. If you want to have such a foolish conversation such as what is the best school in the world, this is certainly an outstanding place. And I congratulate Yang Rei, and I think that he's an outstanding dean, and he's a great scholar, and he's sacrificed great scholarship to take on the deanship for a period of time. And I think we're all very grateful to him, because it's really important to have someone with his understanding and his sensibility in the seat at a difficult geopolitical moment like we're having now. I think he's really well equipped to lead the school into that, through that. So you're fortunate to have him. We're fortunate that he's sacrificing himself to the degree that he is. But do come back to scholarship, because his work is outstandingly important. And again, in this bicultural way, in this way of bringing all of us into a greater understanding of the different civilizational viewpoints and different traditions that we can bring to bear on the present. Well, I sincerely wish the school well. I mean, 40 years is a good achievement, but may you have a brilliant, socially useful, intellectually exciting, and economically prosperous next 40 years as well. No? Okay. Here we are. We're moving. So I have to say that the temptation to throw away the prepared text and discuss the current geopolitics was quite strong. Research cooperation and cross-border mobility at the moment are hostages to rising tensions around the world and securitization of academic decisions and somewhat heavy-handed administrative decisions being made in many places. At East China Normal last week, I heard of a doctoral student from social science who is denied a US visa, not because her research had particular security implications, but because she studies in a university which is subject, like nearly all universities, to a national government, which, like all national governments, has a military. So by that logic, she's tainted by the fact that she's from a university which has a military. As I said, almost every research university in the world has a military. Meanwhile, there are some early signs in China that things might be starting to close up a bit as well. Cold Wars flourish in reciprocal moves. That's what happens. Closure on one side is sometimes followed by closure on the other, or some, partial lack of trust. And lack of trust has been the underlying theme of when the West has been looking at China. I don't think there's much we can do in our field about the fact of a Cold War. We can only resolutely continue to all work together, making clear our common commitment to scholarly exchange and to each other, to our people on all sides, if you like, and while we support those who are victimised and discriminated against in all places as well. Just sometimes this Cold War is absurd enough to be funny. I don't know whether anyone saw the Financial Times in the last 24 hours. If they have, they've already read this story. The UK government has just commissioned new metal badges for the caps worn by members of the regiments. And the reason why there's new badges required is that King Charles III has changed the design of the crown on the badge. Elizabeth used St. Mary's crown. He wants a classic Tudor crown. It's a little bit more in your face, big lion kind of crown. And this work has been contracted to a company called Wydene Weaving in Yorkshire, which has been doing this sort of work for a long time. And it's got a established production chain, which includes some Chinese components in the metal badges. So now there's now a furor about this in the UK because the Department of Defence is becoming concerned that, and various politicians have come in on the act, that the authorities in Beijing, quote, could take the opportunity to implant a GPS transmitter or a tracking device in these badges. Well, and of course, people are saying, why aren't they being made in England? And that's a hard argument to answer, isn't it? Why aren't they being made in England? Everyone's making stuff at home these days. But there's a sort of comeback to that argument. The comeback is because that would cost more. That would cost more. And that's usually a clinching argument in the UK. The company, of course, is saying, well, we've been doing this for 14 years. We've got the same production system. No one has ever mentioned tracking devices before. That's a bit weird. And anyway, we've got a contract. So it goes. It's I think, technically still unresolved, but it looks to me like the Department of Defence is not going to commission, somehow is going to wiggle out of commissioning these suspicious part Chinese badges. They will never reach the British cap, but there you are. So we can expect to see more of these sorts of things, I suspect. And the Financial Times story ends up saying, well, all this shows that this working out of relations between the UK and China in this era is going to get weirder before it gets clearer. That's probably true. But I won't throw away any more of the prepared speech. And instead of expanding on the geopolitics, I'll discuss some longer term issues. And I must immediately apologise to Hugo, because you've heard a good part of this before already at HERA, but I think I've kind of added a bit to it since. My starting point is higher education's positioning in the eyes of government and the public after 30 years of neoliberal policies. I discussed the elements of higher education, how these are jeopardised by what's now becoming a firmer economic policy trajectory in many countries, and how we might respond as educators. The paper begins by identifying two domains of higher education. The intrinsic domain, which is the inner life of the sector, teaching, learning, research, and the extrinsic, where we make our social connections and contributions. I then reflect on Gert Bierce's famous 3 functions of education, which many of you will know: qualification, socialization, and subjectification. And our political cultures are currently placing all the emphasis on qualification. And they've rooted in a narrow interpretation of the individual and an emptying out of society. So it's all about graduate employability, graduate salaries. Our strategy in response can focus on socialization and subjectification, those partly now forgotten core functions of education in general and higher education in particular. And I've summarized a possible approach to socialization and subjectification with these rubrics of the common and global good in relation to socialization and student self-formation in relation to subjectification. And because the issues of the individual and the social, which are integral to this discussion, play out differently in East Asia and in the Euro-American West, I have a brief look at how the individual-society relationship plays out in those different domains and how that affects the conversation. I realise that this touches the surface of a complex set of issues. It's the beginning of a conversation in many respects, but I think it's worth opening it up. And like Yang Ray, I think in many respects, the way forward might lie in East-West hybridities. And I'll also try to reach that point. Well, first, the intrinsic and extrinsic, this distinction I'm making, the institutional higher education terrain on which all of the other issues are shaped. Now, the intrinsic domain is old, goes right back to the beginning of higher education. It's the classical core, the education of students and the transmission, dissemination, and since Humboldt, 1810, the creation of knowledge, the investigation, the scientific investigation added to the transmission and dissemination of scholarship and knowledge. Every historical form of higher education has coupled student learning with scholarly knowledge. That's the essence of higher education. The imperial academies in China, the Buddhist monasteries in India, the Academy at Athens, scholarly mosques in the Islamic world, the medieval European university, and the research university everywhere still is using this basic coupling of education of students and knowledge. Now, this age-old process of student formation in classes and the transmission, dissemination, and creation of knowledge are cultural activities, not administrative, not economic. They can only really be understood, I think, as cultural activities. Student formation joined to knowledge carries the autonomy of the sector, the traditional autonomy, the freedom to learn, teach, and inquire, as it was so brilliantly put in Germany in the 19th century. And it also shapes its distinctive internal organisation. So higher education is grounded in epistemic disciplines, study programs in departments or schools. Notice that the 2 intrinsic activities, teaching, learning, and scholarship research, are both distinct and connected. So they're both connected to each other in practical ways. People combine them in their work. That the research and knowledge part informs the teaching and so on, but they're also distinct as well. They're different skills to some extent, different uses of time and so on. You've got student learning is knowledge intensive, teaching research nexus is the foundation of academic labour. So this two processes brought together. That's the key to the whole operation, and it goes back to the Western Jiao, basically. It's that old, it's 3,000 years old. Now, this intrinsic domain, this kind of mystery of what we do, which we're so familiar with, is not familiar to governments, industry, the public. And that can trigger resentment, this mystery. Yet, in many respects, this intrinsic core is what higher education is. Take it away, and we don't have universities anymore. Extrinsic domain sustains the external social, economic, political, and cultural roles of the sector. It's why we've become so large, because this has worked for, generally speaking, worked well for the societies in which higher education is housed. Unlike the intrinsic domain, the extrinsic domain requires engagement with social partners, extensive engagement with social partners, especially in relation to occupations, preparation for work, professions, and so on. And of course, if you look around the world and different historical stages, it doesn't have the same consistency and constancy as the intrinsic functions. the extrinsic activities have been different from society to society. I mean, in Imperial China, it was about training scholar officials for the service of the state. In the Buddhist monasteries in India, it was about the reproduction of religion, and it was also about the development of technologies and the export of technologies to the surrounding societies. There are a lot of things, and also the preservation of very large amounts of knowledge, recycling of books, if you like, over generations. So different functions carried out by different kinds of higher education in the extrinsic domain. And crucially, of course, it includes vocational preparation and the first steps on graduate pathways. It also includes the preparation of students in the exercise of their citizen responsibilities and rights. It includes, I suppose, what we do in international and intercultural relations, and also the many collective applications of higher education that aren't particular to formation of students, such as the faculty contribution to government, which is everywhere, is quite considerable. The work of higher education in the evolution of cities and regions, the contribution of university research to university innovation, really major areas are in the extrinsic domain. Now, interesting thing about the relationship between the intrinsic and the extrinsic. The intrinsic domain could be practiced theoretically without the extrinsic, although we probably wouldn't have much money from the government if we did that. We didn't do anything useful. It has happened before, though, in the history of higher education. It has been small and generally self-supporting and so on, while maintaining the character of the intrinsic domain. But the reverse is not true. You can't really have the extrinsic higher education without the intrinsic. It's on that foundation of teaching, learning, and research, knowledge, scholarship that all extrinsic activities are then conducted. It's what makes them possible. I think outside institutions, that's not really understood, how important the intrinsic domain is to the external functions. People think, why don't we just, in a sense, fund the external? Why don't we change the external so it more directly fits our purposes and just support it? Why do we have to have all of this other stuff go along with it? So there's an issue for us there. Now, Biesta. Let's look at these three functions. Some will know this essay very well. Qualification is about knowledge, skills, understandings, dispositions, and forms of judgment that enable students to do something. For example, work. Socialisation is about the preparation of students as, quote, part of social, cultural, and political orders, including norms and values. Perhaps still really important in schooling and not quite as important as in higher education as it has been historically, but in some systems, like in Southeast Asia, for example, and for first degree students, this socialisation aspect is explicit and very important. There's a lot of stuff on ethics and moral training and so on that's part of the curriculum in some countries. Subjectification, most interesting function, this one, is about what Biesta calls the individuating effect of education, the formation of students as self-determining persons, and in our case, primarily through their engagement in disciplinary knowledge. Now, any education worthy of its name, says Gert Biesta, should always contribute to processes of subjectification that allow those being educated to become more autonomous and independent in their thinking and acting. Well, for the most part, socialisation and especially subjectification are grounded directly in this intrinsic cultural core in teaching, learning, and disciplinary knowledge. Socialisation and subjectification, you might say, are direct effects. That's what we actually do. That's the sort of measurable thing that we do at the centre of things. Functions that we control too. That's where our autonomy lies, what we control largely without external intervention. And hence you could say they're functions we can rightly be held fully accountable for. We're fully responsible for those core functions. For the policy and public, subjectification, the formation of the autonomous self-determining person, is the blackest part of the black box. No one really understands that's what we do in socialisation. Subjectification. Yet for many educators, the formation of people as capable persons is the most important thing that we do. Now let's look at each function in turn. I'll start with qualification. There's a striking contrast in the way these three functions are understood and received in the community more generally than beyond the higher education. Now, all three are important to us, but outside, pretty well, only qualification matters. Qualification is especially visible in two social relations fostered in higher education that articulate the lives not only of all graduates, but also affect whole populations and workforces. The first is and arguably our most potent social role, the allocation of different kinds of social status on the basis of level of study, institution attended, and discipline. Higher education is very effective at differentiating populations on the basis of status, with lasting effects on them and the societies in which it all happens. Status is often difficult to acknowledge or define, and it tends to be unmentioned in policy, but it's a powerful motivator and shaper in driving family behaviour, university rankings, competition for entry into elite institutions. Students don't want to go to the institution which provides what they hear provides the best teaching. They do want to go to the institution which is the hardest to get into and has the best reputation. They tend to opt in favour of that which is, I suppose, the highest level that they can receive on what is already to them a quite well-known status hierarchy. People are motivated, driven by status concerns, and we are all affected by them. We all think about them in our work. The second social relation where we have more difficulty, but it's equally important, is the vocational preparation and certification of graduates for different roles in work, the professions and occupations. And the vocational role, of course, is more than a matter of status. It's also instrumental and practical. And so it's mediated in practical ways by employers and the professions, and they do come in and influence the curriculum. So they get back to the inner core to a degree that way. And the vocational role is specific. Graduates are expected to have particular training and certification for named occupations. It's also, in some sense, general. All graduates are meant to fit job requirements and move quickly between training and work. There's a sort of universal generic notion of employability now, which is meant to be cross-field somehow, cross, the particular training and the work that we're talking about. Now, here we're less confident than we are with status allocation, largely because we don't fully control the process. It's received at the other end. And there's a significant gap between what we do and the world of work. And the transition between the two partly depends on other parties. It's not just one that we can determine. Now, remember that both of those extrinsic social relations, both the certification of people and as in terms of status and the certification of people in terms of work, both rest on the intrinsic cultural core, on teaching and learning engaged in knowledge. It's remarkable, isn't it, when you think about it? The cultural formation in knowledge mediates both status allocation and the pathway to vocation. So in that sense, this process is not far from the preparation of scholar officials steeped in the classics in imperial China, except that in some higher education programs, though not others, there are also vocationally specific contents. I suppose the classics have changed. Some people would perhaps suggest that we should spend more time on them than we do. But the texts we use are more variable now, but the process is awfully similar in lots of ways. So, and equally instrumental in terms of both the status and the vocation. So to repeat, the direct effects of higher education intrinsic to the sector play out in cultural formation, largely expressed as socialisation and subjectification, determined by educators related to immersion in knowledge. Unless the state steps in to regulate socialisation, it doesn't usually regulate subjectification. It can, though, regulate socialisation. It can say what values you need to acquire, what kind of curriculum you should do, whether you should do a particular political preparation, for example, is one of the things that the state can do. But a lot of states don't. They stay away from specifying the socialisation mechanism. So it's largely determined by us, socialisation and subjectification. But the qualification function is only meaningful in terms of society's external valuation. Ultimately, the sign-off has to be society, the employer, the state on behalf of the economy, and so on. And qualification is the function most often referenced in policy and public discussion. For example, private returns to degrees, employability, and credentialing. Families are not queuing up outside the gate to be socialised and subjectified, though those functions directly shape individuals and also, through them, the society. The public nature of qualification derives partly from its extrinsic visibility and its instrumental value, but it's also a matter of power. Government, employers, and public have some authority or some right to authority in what graduates should or could do. Employability is now installed in higher education discourse with considerable moral weight. Unfortunately, the focus on extrinsic qualification has become one-sided in many respects, neglecting the other functions as if higher education can and should be shaped solely from outside. Worse, a narrow instrumental version of qualification has taken hold in the Anglophone West, where governments pass down to the higher education sector responsibility for both prosperity and social justice. Some governments now argue that the task of universities and other tertiary institutions is to generate, quote, job-ready graduates. The inference is that if graduates are unemployed, then higher education is at fault, no one else. This is quite wrong. Cultural preparation in higher education is different to work. The best vocational learning is on the job. The transition between education and work takes time, even if you build in work experience during the program, and universities do not create jobs, nor can they abolish unemployment. But that's how they've been positioned. So we have a problem. The human capital narrative infers a linear throughput from education to potential productivity, human capital, to work. This is misleading. Productivity is a function of capital-labor relations in context, not solely determined by abstract labour power. It rests on demand for labour as well as its supply, and depends crucially on whether labour is used to its potential at a given moment. And the degree is not the only determinant of earnings. Family background continues to play a key role after graduates enter the workforce. And that's true of every society. In Norway, for example, a study showed that about 45% of first jobs that went to male graduates was in an organisation where they had which was owned or run, administered by a blood relative, a male blood relative, and that's Norway, egalitarian Norway. So that's how it works for graduates. It's not just what we do for them. Sadly, we're not that important. It's also about family background and all the other things that affect outcomes. But the human capital narrative has colonised many economic ministries and the popular mind. It's a simple story in a way, isn't it? Partly because we in higher education have sold the sector as the pathway to individual and collective prosperity through the human capital equation. We've failed to develop a more sector-specific economics of education, parallel to the way learning theory developed as a branch of psychology. We need an economics of higher education which captures its particular character. For example, the role of the status, prestige factor, which is different to, positional goods operate in a different fashion to manufactured goods in manufacturing sector, for example. So we need an economics of higher education which allows this to be understood. What we have at the moment is mainstream economics plonked on top of higher education as if it's an economic machine of the conventional kind, which it's not. So massification and graduate unemployment have now made more fraught the qualification function, given this narrow reading of qualification. And if the qualification function is seen to falter, like it is in many parts of the world right now, that sets the intrinsic core against the extrinsic power. And there are signs that governments are now pressing harder on employability. Ominously, OECD, always a sensible place in terms of higher education policy, has now declared itself in favour of micro-credentials, which bypass the proper engagement in knowledge. The socialisation and subjectification functions are obviously irrelevant in a short program like that, and even they expect, according to Schleicher anyway, this is the way to solve the problem of socioeconomic inequalities in higher education outcomes. You can create a merit-based system, a genuine one which won't be affected by prior inequalities if you go to micro-credentials. So there you are. So job readiness is the key. The micro-credentials give you job readiness and that's it. Now you can see the emerging problem. I mean, how we're positioned in relation to this sort of discussion is I suppose puts us on the defensive. If a government set out tomorrow to design a new higher education that was focused on employable graduates, it would not use the cultural formation of students as the mechanism. It would not use academic disciplinary knowledge. It would not use departments, faculties, professors, and the teaching research nexus. It wouldn't have universities. Now, it's obvious that if higher education or something approximating to it was focused only on graduate employability and no longer troubled to provide a systematic cultural immersion in knowledge, socialisation and subjectification would be thinned out. Now, that's obvious to us. I don't think it's necessarily obvious to anyone else. We've been critiquing the neoliberal framing of higher education for 3 decades, and our critiques are entirely convincing and coherent to us within higher education, but we've failed to shake the diehard loyalists of neoliberalism and the economic ministries across the world. And they have a strong line into government, the media, and the public mind. So I think the key to unlocking this problem goes deeper than much of our critique up to now. It goes to the relation between the individual and the social, which we, as reproducers of society, have a prime role in mediating. Anglophone neoliberalism, starting at the end of the 1970s, sought to shape a new kind of person in education, or through education, a choice-making self who was subject to economic scarcity. And that was the dominant environment for that person. This kind of self-formation is premised on methodological individualism, which assumes that the social can only be an aggregate of atomised individuals. Collective relations and common good in higher education, therefore, are ontologically meaningless, fundamentally impossible. As Margaret Thatcher stated in that famous interview, which was in Women's Weekly, I think, society, there's no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families. So you are. No such thing as society. It's one of the great classic quotes of all time, because in some ways she was so good at bringing the idea into a very, very sharp focus. She was the perfect neoliberal leader. The imagined neoliberal student self in higher education has an attenuated, bounded, limited kind of agency. I mean, how much power is one student consumer in a mass education market? And it's non-developmental in terms of self and identity. Neoliberalism disregards socialisation and subjectification, except to the extent that mentalities and behaviours appropriate to competitive economic markets are being fostered in graduates. And of course, the consumption of their higher education is meant to shape their outlook as neoliberal subjects for the rest of their lives. The consumer model excludes the student as a learner, as an educational subject. Neoliberalism locates higher education as a branch of the economy whose value is computed, as in methodological individualism, as the aggregation of individual graduate earnings. So you tally up all of the extra earnings from education, and that becomes the contribution of education to GDP. This lifts extrinsic economic regulation above all the other social relations at work in the education sector. The self-determining student has been freed of all other constraints and yet is firmly governed by external economic forces. For example, in neoliberal UK, and the recipe has had one system in which it's been fully implemented, and that's the UK. Domestic higher education is modelled as a £9,250 quasi-market, and the Office for Students calibrates institutional performance in the market and informs the consumers thereby using comparative data on graduate earnings and surveys of student consumer satisfaction. So go to the places where you earn the most is the message. Go to the places where the student satisfaction rating is highest is the message. Hence, graduates from courses in nursing or teaching, which are lower paid professions, are less valuable by definition. And the institutions that focus on those and the disciplines, the faculties within institutions that focus on teaching and nursing are essentially trashed by these comparisons. Not a good time to be an education school in the UK, not a good time to be a nursing school. The non-pecuniary effects of higher education slip off the radar. Now, is that what students want? Well, learning is harder than consuming. Yet a recent doctoral study at Oxford, based on surveys of student attitudes to tuition fees, found that most students identified more strongly as proactive learners than as passive consumers. There were some students who put the consumption function first, but the majority put the education function first. It's clear everyone wanted a graduate job. And they want to be employable in that sense, but they also all want more than employability, some more than others. There's a heterogeneity in what students want, but it's usually multiple and doesn't exclude the education function in all but a tiny number of cases. My purpose in foregrounding socialisation and student self-formation is to push back against the focus only on qualification, narrowly defined, by foregrounding the richer contributions of higher education to individual students and collective society. Our role in preparing people for work and professional life is crucial, but it's only one part of what we do. And it's more solid if it's intrinsically grounded in the formation of the person and the person as a social subject. Without socially responsible and humanistic socialisation and subjectification, graduates would be more selfish, less public-spirited, and less empowered throughout their lives. The classic model based on Bildung in the West and Confucian self-cultivation in the East, the classic model of broad-based higher education prepares people better than a sole focus on qualification. We had it right. We have it right. We have to defend and advance that. But how do we do that? And that's the question. Well, I suggest there's two questions to consider in relation to socialisation, and one of them is difficult. First, to what extent should we other form our students on the basis of prescriptive values, to put it as pejoratively as possible? Now, that's an easier question to answer in East Asia, where socialisation is often formally part of things and where the notion of social values, social order, and social values is widely accepted as something you can explicitly address in education. Now, some in the West would argue that our task is to help students to decide for themselves, not to tell them what to think. And it doesn't essentially matter what kind of program they do or what the values are, as long as they learn to be thinking individuals. Now, note that when we do inculcate values, and I think we should inculcate values, there is a potential tension between the socialisation, sort of top-down socialisation function, and the bottom-up subjectification process. And of course, much then depends on what kind of social, cultural, and political order we have in mind. That was the first question. I think that's the tricky one. The second one's a bit easier to answer. Should we focus on higher education for public and common good, locally, nationally, and globally, or should we just focus on its contribution to nation building and capital accumulation as measured by GDP? Should we prepare students for collective ecological responsibility in the face of the climate nature emergency? And I think we're all going to say yes to those things, aren't we? Both the individualised and the collective outcomes of higher education matter. The trap that we're caught in presently, the trap partly of our own making, is that because the role of higher education has become defined in instrumental economic terms as pecuniary benefits for individual graduates, earnings, career opportunities, social status, then it does not matter. It might even be good if graduates think only of their private interests and do not take responsibility for society and the world. How then do we conceive the larger contribution of higher education to the public and common good of society? A framework which includes its economic contribution to graduate lives and to national prosperity, but is not limited to those objectives. There are differing ideas of public good in the conversation in English. We've spent 8 years looking at this in a cross-country project. There is the notion of public as associated with the role of government or state. My personal view is that that is going to be part of any commitment to the public or common good. The role of the state has to be in there. It's the only point at which we have a collective coordination in society that we can rely on. It's not always reliable, but it should be reliable. The state is crucial to us. So that meaning of public is fairly straightforward. There's also the normative term public good as a sort of universal condition of beneficence or welfare. You know, the public good that when we hear it makes it sound really normatively positive, that sort of valuable notion of common benefit. There's also the public as an inclusive communicative network like public opinion or the public sphere. There's that meaning of public, which is different again. And there's also the public good, private good dualism in economics. You know, the notion of that some things are that higher education produces some public goods, and they necessarily are financed by the state or philanthropy, and it also produces private goods, and they should be financed by markets, and therefore you should pay tuition fees because you're gaining benefit from your higher education. That sort of use of public and private. Now, that last dual public and private economic version dominates the discussion of higher education financing in some countries. It also leads to a narrow role of government with little commitment to public goods, because government only then funds the things which no one else can fund on a good day at all. So there's 4 different meanings. There's some overlap between the public is inclusive and communicative and the notion of the normative public good. There might be an overlap with the role of the state, and there might be an overlap between the role of the state and with the public-private dualism in economics, but it's pretty incoherent when you try and put all that together. So public and private may not necessarily be the way through this problem. Common good might be more helpful than public good for socialisation. It doesn't have the baggage associated with the public-private dualism in economics. UNESCO, partly in response to the problems of the public's concept in economics, has developed the idea of education as a common good and a global common good, based on probably West European local governance models, I think, Northern Italy, for example, cooperative, egalitarian and solidaristic relations between educational institutions and their local communities, people talking to each other a lot, combined production, that all the stakeholders together, the grassroots stakeholders together, defining the product and taking part in the implementation of the production of the common good in education and other spheres. And I think at global level, the ancient Chinese idea of Qianxia is a genuinely useful starting point for looking beyond Cold War geopolitics and nativist resentment of the other, to think about a worldwide regime of cooperative common good in higher education. We thank Lily for bringing this forward into the global conversation. Not that Lily invented it at all, but bringing forward that long history of Qianxia discussion into the global conversation about higher education. Now, the world-centered type of Qianxia has no border, no other, and is based on harmony and diversity. So they're good starting points, but of course that's the idea. What's the machinery? How does it work? They're more difficult questions. But world-centered Qianxia cannot come too soon, because we, our governments and our societies, have the climate nature emergency on our hands. The economic dynamic of competitive accumulation and the politics of national interest are driving the global ecology off the cliff. You know this. I mean, anyone who reads the information about the Antarctic ice melt, which I do, and the Greenland ice melt, knows that the sea level will be up 5 or 6 meters by the end of the century and will wipe out Shanghai, London, New York, and lots of other cities. I mean, this is really happening. We have an emergency on our hands. The economic dynamic of competitive accumulation, which we teach in our business schools, and the politics of national interest, which are stopping us from addressing this problem, are driving global ecology off the cliff. And I think that puts the socialisation function at the front and centre of the higher education agenda. We have to think about what values our graduates are learning, and what they will take into society, and how they might be able to address the need for change. What kind of social order do we need to meet a challenge like this? What kind of governance do we need? Educators play a key role in developing the conditions under which a better form of cooperative governance can evolve. What changes do we need to get there? I mean, we need early answers to those questions. This, it seems to me, is a pressing issue. If I was starting my career now, I think this is what I would work on. I mean, the existential nature of the crisis is overwhelming. Well, turning now to subjectification, how do we connect better to students by responding to the more agentic and proactive human individuality that's emerged in the modern era across the world? Anthony Giddens describes life as a never-ending reflexive project of the self. Those who've read my work on self-formation will be familiar with the fact that I don't really like Anthony Giddens, but I've quoted him every time I've written a paper on self-formation, because I think that captures the problem exactly as it is. life as a never-ending reflexive project of the self. We now understand ourselves that way in China, in the West, everywhere. One reason why autonomous human reflexivity and projects of self, making the self, are on the agenda is the spread of higher education itself. It creates those capabilities. Students enroll in growing numbers, not just because higher education is the gateway to occupations and social status, because it lifts them as people. It offers cultural resources and techniques that enhance self-efficacy and growth. Graduates might be unemployed, but they have attributes which others don't have, and they benefit from those attributes. One of the ways they benefit, of course, is the capacity to raise hell about the fact that they're not getting what they want. And so graduates are more visible even as unemployed and marginalised workers. What kind of subjectification should they experience then in higher education? And we have some options on offer already. Neoliberal self-making, student as consumer, an economic self-investor. That's a form of reflexive subjectivity. But one in which learning and knowledge are marginal, and perhaps higher education has got less of a role. Or do we think about subjectification in terms of education that helps students to grow via transformative engagement in knowledge, preparing them for varied occupational roles and socially and ecologically responsible citizenship? Well, posing the problem that way, the answer is obvious, isn't it? But let's think about how this might work. I think the subjectification function is best understood as student self-formation. And the idea of self-formation goes like this. Through the development of agentic capabilities that are not just autonomous, but in some sense independent, at the centre of the self, grounded in the inner self and its evolution, students build their personal capacity to learn self-consciously and critically. This moves beyond the old idea of the student being other formed by the teacher and the curriculum, and that being the nature of the pedagogical problem. Now, the teacher in self-formation has an indispensable role in relation to knowledge. Students don't have that, teachers do. It's about immersion in knowledge. We're talking about formation in the context of engagement in knowledge. But higher education and self-formation recognises that only students can do the actual learning, and only students can retain the learning rather than throwing it away at the end of the examination so that it's useful to the end of their lives. Only students can have the kind of deep engagement in learning that self-formation implies. Higher education and self-formation does place, inescapably shifts the pedagogical balance towards the student. It places greater emphasis on the student as self-determining agent. It asks more of the student. It asks more adult and more responsible approach to learning from the student. People form themselves in many social domains. There are three essential aspects of all self-formation. I mean, the autonomy of the learner, reflexive and conscious agency, underlying not only reflexive, which is what this is all about, but conscious as well, and the will to learn, the desire and the practical will to learn. Now, what then is unique to self-formation in higher education, given that all forms of self-formation involve those things? Well, one is immersion in disciplinary knowledge, and I think the second one is perhaps underestimated, but something where many of us have experienced in our student lives. It's relational experiences beyond the classroom, experiences that are formally part of the curriculum sometimes, but mostly informal, and some of them, of course, not organised, but others through things like student societies and cultural activities. But friendship itself, friendship networks are all part of this. The cohort effect, if you like, for many students. You need to be a full-time student. You need to be on campus for that kind of extracurricular dimension, but it's often more formative than the actual curriculum for some students anyway. Now, in the last decade, some of us have begun conceptual discussion and empirical research on higher education as student self-formation. And the primary method of empirical investigation is interview-based ethnographics. And I think Se-Yong went from saying it was an interview project to saying it was an ethnographic project during her study. And I think that, the more interviews, the better for this kind, and the more you can do longitudinal work, the better. Surveys that can be used, but longitudinal interview is probably the most fruitful method, tracing the changes and the self-consciousness of those changes in students. Now, the starting point was a 2014 paper on self-formation of mobile students. And since then, student self-formation has been deployed in about, when I last looked, and this is now 18 months ago, really, 200 studies to explain the changing agency and identity of mobile students, especially those moving between different cultural linguistic zones. So people are undergoing this sort of shock of changing from one cultural zone to another, one language of use to another, and so on, with all the formative effects that are associated with that kind of experience. Now, there's a crossover here between the self-formation work and work on student agency, which again is a fairly small field, but growing and quite significant. And I'd point to Manja Klemenchik's work at Harvard in particular in the agency domain. Kelsey, I know you and colleagues have identified studies of agency and self-formation of mobile students as a genre and provide a systematic review. Some studies have extended the focus to self-formation of all students, not just mobile students. For example, the Milley and Towers paper, which is quite a good paper, and Soyoung's Oxford doctoral study, which looks at academic self-formation amongst Korean students who stay in Korea and also Korean students who go to the UK. There's also parallel work on how academic disciplines shape student mentalities, much longer genre. Basil Bernstein, of course, giant of that discussion, and also Paul Ashman's work now. Higher education and self-formation is an exciting field that can renovate the subjectification function. It can also reinvigorate socialisation, as it implies proactive citizens, the sort of, you might say, Bildung ideal citizens with this get up and go capacity, this proactive capacity to make a difference to others as well as themselves. Reciprocally, it's vital to bring the socialisation mission to bear on student self-formation too, to ensure that student reflexivity, self-development, is focused on larger purposes and values, the common good, not just on graduates' private economic agendas. So it should be, of course, it's going to be about making a successful, satisfying life. And we all should seek that. We all should honour that in others, but one would hope that it's about more than that. Self-formation can be self-formation in a social setting. And that perhaps is one of our core contributions as educators to this discussion about the reflexive modern self. Well, a shift in the balance with less of a singular focus on qualification and more or less equal priority to Biesta's three functions goes to larger questions than just the university's mission statement on the website. Not only does it acknowledge that higher education does more than create value for employers, it can go to the heart of relations between the individual and the social. And as I see it, a larger emphasis on collective social relations and on the self-formation or self-cultivation of students in learning is closer to existing practices and understandings in East Asia than in most of the West. I mean, it fits the Nordic West, I think, better than the Anglophone West. It's more remote from the Anglophone West. As some have argued, that the rise of East Asian higher education research positions the region to play a global leadership role in the next generation idea of a university. And people talk about what's the Chinese idea, although they often say, what's the Chinese idea of the university? Now, the renovation of the socialisation and subjectification functions could be a key, or perhaps the key, to the question, is there a Chinese or East Asian idea of a university? One that emphasises self-formation and socialisation for the common good would be at the core of the Chinese idea of the university. So let's compare socialisation and subjectification East and West and think about how some of this might pan out in different parts of the world. Well, Western societies and universities struggle with these issues because of a deep-seated assumptions of an absolute separation, conflict, or tension between the individual and the social. Let me underline, I've lived my life in this culture, this Western culture. This is absolutely core and fundamental to my societies, the ones I've lived in. This notion that there is this inherent tension, natural tension between the collective the collective social and the individual, and that is manifest as the tension between government and other spheres of society. Every sphere of society in its relationship to government has a contested border, and the issue of autonomy is the central issue in politics so often. So this standoff between the individual and the social is absolutely fundamental to Anglophone society. Less so in Western Europe. There's more balance there. It's better. In this, the social market economy, so-called the German-speaking world, it's better. It's probably better in Southern Europe because of the family traditions. And the Nordic world does better than most parts of the world in relation to the reconciliation. But in the Anglophone world, which has dominated the world for 200 years, let me say, this standoff between the individual and social, absolutely central to everything else. It's not part of Confucian thought. Self-cultivation by the individual, which is the practical heart of Confucianism, focuses on making oneself into a socially appropriate self. This was part of Greek and Roman thought too, but it was later displaced in the West. This is where it gets interesting and a little bit new, thanks to Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault argues that the absolute separation between the individual and the social dates from early Christianity in the late Roman Empire. And remember, early Christianity was the religion of slaves, the downtrodden, the people who had the raw end of this great imperial edifice. The mightiest empire in the Western history was the Roman Empire, that left its stamp on absolutely everything else in the West, and it still is fundamentally important to shaping our lives. And at the bottom end of society was this large category of people who were slaves or poor, and their life was miserable, and they were overwhelmed by this hierarchical environment that they were in. But they found solace in Christianity. Christianity offered them a relief from their suffering, because Christianity said to them, "You're on the way to heaven. If you're a good person, if you do the right thing, you're on the way to heaven." And that was, a magic, a solace to people who were suffering in their day-to-day existence. But in the imaginative process of thinking themselves as on the way to heaven, the early Christians externalized society, separated themselves from society, and focused instead on the kingdom to come, the kingdom of the blessed to come, and away from the world that they were in. So society was externalized in relation to the self, and this was taken into Judeo-Christian or Christian thinking in the West. And with society externalized in relation to the self, then conformity with the norms of society, as it was in the Roman Empire, was seen as something imposed on the self from outside themselves. Conformity was no longer coming from within, but it was being imposed from without, because these are subjects who've been separated themselves from the social in some inner self sense, in some fundamental way. So social order then derives from respect for the law and external authority, not the work of the self on the self as in the East, not self-cultivation encouraging conformity with the norms of society. So here you have a different social individual relationship. So the Western self was readily seen as against society and the state. And when Western activists critiqued the authorities, rather than calling on them to behave as the state should behave, rather than doing what the demonstrators did at Tiananmen until the last 2 or 3 days, saying this is what the state should do, this is what a good state should do, instead of that, the Western activists challenged the authorities in the name of a natural self that was separate from and prior to society and was inviolate and should not be violated, and it was seen to be suppressed by the authorities. So the recurring pattern in the West is the pattern of rebellion against the social order in the name of the natural self. I mean, Rousseau epitomizes this in the French Revolution, Enlightenment period. And this really comes together, this notion of the separated self and the rebellion against the social order in the name of the self in the French and American revolutions, where the modern Western polities were shaped, where liberalism was really grounded. Liberal theory sees individuals as best able to determine their own good without external imposition. No need for the state to tell them what's proper, more moral. So at best, Westerners are deeply committed to agency freedom and the value of every person's life. And that's probably the good thing we draw from the Western tradition. But the state and supports for democratic humanism are left hanging loose. So how do you secure these good things if you're so much against regulation by the state and you refuse the notion of the collective society? It's assumed that when all persons separately determine their own good, this accumulates to the best possible society. Neoliberalism is one extreme of the more general position, one in which, in case of neoliberalism, the full of humanism and freedom, which is the best of the Western tradition, has been discarded, has been emptied out, except in the economy, only there. The Western separation of individual and social is not quite universal, let me say. I mean, John Dewey, for example, just treats it with contempt, and he just says it's absurd to place individual and society in antithesis. It's like the relationship between the alphabet and the letters. You can't have one without the other. But this notion of absolute separation, of unconstrained individual freedom as the absence of responsibility to society, this notion that you're freer the further away you are from society, is powerfully imagined in the West, and especially in the United States. Here you have Trump. Here you have the Joker in Batman, that kind of character. This explains much, and this explains Trump's appeal to many. They see that he's playing out the role which they would like to play out themselves. And this explains much, I think, about the evolution of Anglophone education policy, the singular focus on qualification, the indifference to socialisation, and the relegation of subjectification and student self-formation to consumer value for money. Now let's now move to a zone I know less about, but I'm interested in, the individual and social in the East. I said earlier that self-formation entails the autonomy of the learner, reflexive and conscious agency, and the will to learn. In higher education, there's also knowledge and extracurricular experiences. Well, you might say, what's new? All but the last are foundational to Confucian educational practice. In addition, the Sinic tradition provides a coherent relation between the individual and the social, nesting the smaller self in successive layers of family, community, state, and tianxia. And Confucian self-cultivation is expected to constitute a social citizen. This resolves the relation between socialisation and subjectification. I'm sure broadly all that's true, and we look to the Chinese ideas to help the evolution of conscious and reflexive self-formation outside China. But is Confucian self-cultivation sufficient to propel the self-determining agency that's the necessary heart of self-formation, where when individuality has become more potent in all societies, in all countries, including China and the rest of East Asia? There's an academic discussion in English on individuality in China, and another on individualism. Less interesting because it's paired in an ideological manner with the dualistic opposite, collectivism. I say less interesting because that's misleading. I mean, you can have individuality and collective relations at the same time, and distrust anything that ends in ISM, ism. You have to worry about those terms. They usually have an ideological component to them. So I don't like the individualism, collectivism notions, although I recognise the importance of collectivism in East Asia. I mean, but individuality in China has a long history, and I'm just beginning to get a sense of some of its different forms. For example, in the Warring States period, the Taoist Zhang famously advocates this ever-changing inner self that withdraws from politics and economic self-interest, and that notion of the individual expressing themselves fully and living that completely, which reminds me a little bit of the cynics in Greece, who set themselves outside society and lived there and expressed themselves with great honesty and consistency, although perhaps in a more doctrinaire and rather more narrow way than in this case. But I mean, that's very different, of course, to the notion of the individual and strengthening the notion of the individual as an economic choice-making agent or an entrepreneur in Western liberalism. So there's lots of different ways you can understand the enhancement of the individual, and lots of ways you can do that in Chinese tradition. But many scholars, including Yang Rui, I think, at one point, have argued that the Chinese individual has long been pressed down by the weight of social relations, the successive layers, especially the family and the state. And that might be a core kind of problem, not just of the party-state period in China, but of the Sinic experience more generally, maybe the whole accumulating tradition, in which the power of the traditional family has been somewhat displaced, but then there are new external encumbrances on the person, which might narrow the capacity to take initiatives. since just going to find the right spot here. There we are. Since 1949, regulated individuality has evolved continually in China, and the Maoist collectivism triggered the separation of the individual from the traditional family. Process of collectivist individualization, as it's been called, this disembedding from the traditional family, where you go right through your whole life beholden to an ancestor. And for many people, that was a freeing up from the encumbrances of the past. And then in the opening up after 1978, everything changes, and the embedding in collective production units is also fragmented as well. And so, and then you've got the large-scale migration from the countryside to the cities, and single individuals disembedded from their families, old or traditional or smaller, and from their collective production units. Some are living soul life, making new associations, forming new families, new grungy networks, and so on. But definitely making choices about how they develop themselves. Yangshan Yan recounts stories of young migrants who felt pressured to adapt to the new market society when they arrived in the cities, and they often just through lifestyle expression, constantly reinventing themselves. Yan also states that the turn to more individual expression and lifestyle choice was facilitated by the party state as a modernisation strategy, and among other aspects, embodies neoliberal self-responsibilisation, that is, the transfer of responsibility for welfare from the state to the individual. So the state, to some extent, is fashioning a new individual as a vehicle for this transfer of the burden of responsibility back to the person. There's a persistent critique in what I've read, and I'm really just working my way through this, that sonic individuality is fundamentally patterned beyond agentic control. People are sliding into roles that they feel they have to perform in, and lacks authenticity. But the same thing is said about individuality in modern individuality in the West, that people are simply inauthentically taking up roles which are assigned in the culture. Now, while China is especially favourable for fashioning socialisation and subjectification, as the individual is always socially embedded, that hasn't changed. It's just the forms of it have changed. It seems that the next step would be to rework the relation between the individual and society to allow a stronger and more diverse individual agency to emerge. I mean, the state will never be far away in China. It's never been far away, except in periods of chaos, and we don't want those. But by the same token, the state has the scope to foster room to move for the person. The state can foster agency freedom. The state can choose to do this without ceasing to be the state. It doesn't have to be overly cautious about the individual. It can give the individual more room to move. To repeat, a stronger individual and a robust social are not zero-sum. A stronger individual and a robust social order are not zero-sum. The idea of the individual social trade-off is a Western idea. It's not a universal idea. It's not necessary to Chinese thought, and it's not a necessary practice anywhere in the West or elsewhere. The dual enhancement of both individual and social is within reach in East Asia, because both the autonomous person and their social embeddedness are already well developed. It's the West that has problems with the social embeddedness, but China has that. In Chinese, Ren is integral to life, the basis of moral development and self-transformation, and Ren exists in relationships. So the person, self-transforming person, is positioned in the culture in relationships. Higher education as student self-formation strengthens the subjectification function by building the reflexive agency of students via engagement in knowledge and shared extracurricular experiences. It's different to the neoliberal model of student as consumer because it's genuinely student-centred, it's empowering for students, and it's also knowledge-centred and empowering through knowledge. Building student agency in this way enhances the student's capability as a lifelong learner, including preparation for working life, social participation, and personal responsibility. It can also be a profoundly satisfying form of education. And I think for many of us, we think about self-formation particularly in relation to the doctoral experience, where we're conscious of how we're evolving mentally, how we consciously shape our knowledge-based journey through the things we choose to read and think about. And that once we've done that, we know we can do that for the rest of our lives. But I've met undergraduates who can think that way. I didn't think that way so well when I was an undergraduate, but I think today's students maybe are a bit better than I was. Higher education and self-formation allows us to rethink the nature of the student and faculty-student relations too. The emerging conscious student agency, itself a primary outcome of the learning process, is given respect, while faculty work is more specifically centred on knowledge and responsibility for guiding students in social relations, which we might call the moral order of society. That raises the large question of the relation between self-formation and socialisation. And as I see it, it's vital that the self-formation of students is also social formation. Induction of the student cohort into social relations as common good in a conscious and explicit manner. And both Confucian thought and Bildung talk about that. But this closes the gap in the West between the individual and society. We need to close that gap. I see higher education for the common good and higher education as student self-formation as especially consistent with the educational roots of East Asia, the Chinese civilizational zone. At the same time, in East Asian as well as Western systems, the independent autonomy of the learner has been underplayed up to now. University students have been often seen as more as children than as adults, and the common good has been understood simply as economic accumulation and national security. The ecology, the planet, our conditions of existence in the immediate future have been a secondary priority. The way forward lies in a combination of East Asian social awareness and responsibility in which the role of the state is understood as is and should be positive, with the kind of Western humanism where every life is respected and creativity is facilitated and encouraged. That is not far from Confucian humanism. I'm quite sure that we can strengthen the individual and the social together, and that educators have the primary role in this process. If this perspective is implemented in higher education, we can contribute to long-term social and ecological transformation. That is a bigger prize than the defence against neoliberalism. But the defence is likely to be more successful if we go on the strategic offensive. I know that this grand vision is not going to tumble into place tomorrow, but I believe it's the right pathway. It's the necessary response to neoliberalism in higher education, and it may be essential if our noble work is to prosper in future, because we're also fighting for the survival of the university and its tradition. And I think it's coherent, it's intellectually coherent, and it fits the times when the agency of young people is advancing to our benefit. And I think it can be carried in the world by rising East Asia. Thank you kindly for listening.